Hey, here to read chapter 11 of The Diamond in the Window, and it's called Pearls from Coromandel and Diamonds from Brazil. But first, I have to say thank you to Christopher for bringing me teacher appreciation gifts, and for Shelly for sending me a very nice picture for teacher appreciation. So let's get started. Eleanor felt small, terribly small, much smaller than she had ever felt before. Her small heart was beating at great speed. She was furry. Her arms were crouched under her, and they had a new kind of wiry, tiny strength. Her ears felt strangely different and huge and alive to a different source of whisperings and cracklings and rustlings. At the end of her nose was a strange sensation, a kind of trembling awareness. She reached up a hand and felt at her nose. The fingers of her hand wouldn't separate. They were attached together and folded into a smooth little paw, but they could feel long, vibrating hairs fanning out into whiskers. Behind her was another strange thing, a sense of sensitive support at the rear, a long, agile prop. A tail. She was a mouse. Her whisker ends brushed something nearby. It felt warm and friendly and furry. Eleanor crowded closer and snuggled against it, fur against fur. It was another mouse. "Hello," said Edward. "Isn't this nice?" "Where are we?" said Eleanor, looking up. Her eyes felt big and beady and sharp. Her nose quivered and wrinkled. There was a new kind of cleverness in her five senses, and another kind of sixth sense that seemed instinct in every smooth hair of her coat, and all down the bare length of her tail to the very tip. "I think this is a nest," said Edward. "I think it's our nest," said Eleanor. Through a hole in the top of the nest she could see the night sky. She made a sudden movement and found herself looking out of the hole. Eddie silked his way up beside her. It was wonderful to move like a mouse. Together they looked out. Their nest lay in the forked branch of an alder tree that stood among other alders at the edge of a body of water. "Is it the ocean?" asked Eleanor. Edward studied it a minute. "No," he said, "it's Walden Pond. Come on, I want to feel what it's like to run with 4 feet." The 2 mice crept out of their nest, their heads cocked and alert. Then, swiftly, they ran down to the ground and darted into the leafy cover of the shore. Running on 4 feet, Edward decided joyfully, was more like roller skating than anything else. His 4 legs worked rhythmically and knowingly under him, with 1,000 rapid patterings, and the rest of him was carried along smoothly, without the bumps and jogs and sharp recoil that lumbering human feet make when they hit the hard ground. He wanted to try it some more. "Let's go," he said. He poked his wiggling nose out from under the enormous umbrella of dried oak leaves and then scurried forth on his roller skate feet again. Eleanor followed with a few nervous half-starts. Why did it seem so natural to cower under the leaf and to rush so quickly from one cover to the next? Timidly, she darted after Eddie, who was scrambling happily from one great pebble along the shore to another. "Come on," she said. "Let's look for Ned and Nora." Eddie pattered on ahead. "Where do you think that we should look?" he said, poking his nose this way and that under the growth along the shore. He was trying to find a clear lane along which he could try to get up some real speed. At last, he found what he was looking for. Under the tree-like growth of blueberry bushes and the sumac trees, there were little branching paths, minute little highways along which he could scuttle at breakneck speed, his reluctant mouse sister hurrying after him. Intersecting these tiny hidden byways were broader avenues. Whose thoroughfares were these? They soon found out. "Look out!" warned Eleanor, nipping Edward's tail. Her teeth were wonderfully sharp, and Edward was hurt so badly he leaped sideways. But he was just in time to be out of the way of the vast hairy body that came lumbering down the right-of-way. The 2 mice cowered under a clump of fern that was like a forest of palm trees and watched it go by. It was a raccoon, padding on his 4 black hands along the path on the way to the water's edge to paddle in the shallows. "Let's just stay here and watch the world go by," said Eleanor. They made themselves comfortable between the bristling stumps of long dead ferns and looked out with their bright black eyes. Their mouse hearts fluttered, and their marvelous ears cocked this way and that, picking up an earful of news. They heard a loon's weird cry in the water, now near, now far away. Something in Eleanor's velvet hide told her that she was safe. She leaned against Edward, enjoying his brotherly warmth and savoring the sense of being nothing at all, a part of the night and the woods and nothing more. There was a goose honking over in the pond. High above them in the top of the hickory tree, the sound of a wood thrush was singing. "Listen, listen," said Edward. Then there was another sound. Edward and Eleanor were aware of it at the same instant and cocked their ears toward it. It was a deep, earth-shaking double thud. There was nothing animal-like or bird-like about it. It was a solid, rhythmical, steady boom-boom, as of a great weight driving into the ground. It approached and grew stronger. Then it cast a giant shadow across the moon, and the two little mice looked up and up. It was a man. He was walking along the forest path, his knees brushing against the blueberry bushes, his boots treading softly, heel toe, but carrying such height and weight in them that they sent solid vibrations into the ground. "Let's follow him," said Eddie. They crept out of the protection of the clump of fern and ran after him in little rushes to this side and that. Where was he going? He was going home. And home was a little house in the middle of the woods, growing up like something as natural as the woods, as natural to the woods as the pitch pine trees creaking against its shingles. The thudding stopped. The towering man stood still. He was reaching into his pocket. Then he stooped and sprinkled something on the ground. Edward and Eleanor stopped in their tracks and watched. But the man didn't look at them. Instead, he got up again to his full height and disappeared against the blackness of the house. They could hear his door open and shut, and a moment later they could see light shining through the small panes of glass in the window. He was gone. Edward discovered at the end of his wrinkling nose a tremendous curiosity. What had the man scattered on the ground? He moved cautiously forward, his nose leading the way surely and certainly. Oh, there it was. He found a large breadcrumb. He gobbled it and then found another and took it back to Eleanor. She had never seen anything that looked or smelled so delicious. She sat up on her hind legs, held the breadcrumb between her front paws, and ate it delicately. She wanted another. Edward was already out again foraging. He came back. "Come on," he said. "Get your own. There's hundreds of them." He put them there just for us. Eleanor ran her tongue over her mouse chops. Never in her girl life had she tasted anything so good as a breadcrumb. But the clearing where the crumbs were scattered was empty of cover. Eleanor peered out into the moonlight and sought out a single tempting breadcrumb, scampered out after it, and picked it up with her teeth and hurried back. Then she reared up comfortably again and ate it between her paws. Goodness, it was so satisfying. It tasted like more, and more tasted like still more. Eleanor picked up one crumb at a time and then two. Edward was simply wandering from crumb to tempting crumb. Just one more, he kept saying to himself. Then he would run back under the leaves. There was a particularly delicious-looking piece of crust over there. He started for it, but Eleanor was there first. She bit deeply into it and started to eat it then and there. Edward batted at her with his paw. "I saw it first," he said. "Finders keepers," squeaked Eleanor sharply. She gnawed daintily away. Edward angrily sank his long teeth into the other end of the crust and tugged. For a moment, the two of them jerked feverishly at it, glaring into each other's eyes. They were so enraged with each other that they paid no attention to a new sound, a soft, rushing whirring overhead. All at once, the bread gave way, and Eleanor fell over. Every hair on her body stood up on end. "Beware!" cried her sixth sense. There was a huge dark shape above her, grasping and grasping. If the bread hadn't broken, the shape would have had her. She leaped to her feet and darted this way and that in tacking fits and starts. The shadow disappeared and then fell on her again. It missed, and then it lifted and hovered over her. Eleanor skittered frantically from side to side. Her rapid mouse heartbeat accelerated to a terrible staccato of thumping. But suddenly Eddie was ahead of her, running. He squeaked to her, "To the house! Hole in the cellar!" Then he spurted away, leading the great looming, flopping, grasping shadow after him. Eleanor made a dash for the house and scrambled over the stones of the foundation, found a chink between them, and tumbled in. Then she scrabbled back to the hole and looked out. It was an owl, an ordinary New England screech owl. Eddie was running spasmodically in short left, right dashes in front of it, but each dash was a little shorter. With each one, the owl missed him by less and less. They were coming this way. Could he reach the side of the house and safety? "Come on, Eddie," squealed Eleanor. He was almost there, but the owl was there first. It flopped between Eddie and the house. Eddie stopped short. The great owl eyes glowed at him. Hypnotized, Eddie stared back. It was very odd, but it was true. He recognized the owl. The face of the bird of prey with its shadow eyes and hooked beak was one he had seen before. Wasn't it the same as... But the owl was lifting its talons to plunge at him. Then Eleanor helped. With a mighty shove, with all her miniature strength, she dislodged a loose pebble from the side of the hole in the wall. It fell on the owl's back, and the bird flapped a few feet into the air with a disconcerted screech. Not far, but just far enough for Eddie to see his chance and take it. Breathlessly, just ahead of the owl's claws, he tumbled into the dark opening in the wall and lay panting on his side on the floor. Eleanor huddled against him and waited. She could feel Eddie's sides heaving up and down. After a while, the heaving stopped, but he lay still a moment longer. At last, he was recovered enough to stand up on his 4 feet. They were ready to look around them, and ready to listen to something besides the hammering of their own hearts. Why, there was music. From far overhead, floating down through the cracks in the floorboards, there came a thin, reedy fluting. The notes wandered mournfully up and down. They made no recognizable melody. They sounded more like the natural music of the loon or the wood thrush out of doors than any man-made music. Edward and Eleanor had to see for themselves. They ran up a pile of sacks smoothly rounded with grain and found a knothole in one of the floorboards. They squeezed through it and scuttled across the floor of the lighted room to a hiding place beside the hearth. From there, they could look out and observe the man. He sat turned away from them at a small table, leaning his chair back on its 2 rear legs. He was blowing on a wooden flute. The haunting music charmed them. They had but one thought, to see his face. Carefully, they crept out of their hiding place and moved noiselessly around the wall to the other side of the small room. From here, they could only see the thick trousers and the heavy boots. Then the music stopped and the chair tipped forward on all 4 legs. The flute was put down and there was a rushing of paper, and then there became a strange scratching noise. What was he doing? The 2 mice simply had to know. Softly, they ran up one of the rear legs of the table and hid behind a pair of books that lay on its top. From there, they could peer out cautiously at him. The scratching sound had come from his pen. He was writing. "It's Henry," whispered Eleanor. It was Henry indeed. He was homelier than the sculptured Henry that stood in the parlor at home, but his face had a kind of sun-browned strength. He was looking down at the page across which his pen was moving so surely. Edward's beady eyes looked down at it too, and there he saw something extraordinary. "Oh, Eleanor, look!" he said, pointing at it with one paw. Then she saw it too. Out of Henry's scratching pen, a series of shining blots was flowing. They were jewels. They lay upon the paper like a sentence of pearls, whole paragraphs and pages of glittering diamonds. It was the treasure they had been seeking, the pearls from Coromandel and the diamonds from Brazil. And having found the treasure, Eleanor and Edward came to the end of their dream and burrowed their way back into consciousness in the real world of the morning. They woke up together and sat up in their beds. Someone was calling. It was Aunt Lily, hallooing up the attic stairs. "Hurry up, children," she was saying. "It's the first day of school." Edward got up first, feeling unpleasantly pink and smooth without his mousy fur, and clumsily gigantic. He rubbed the places where his whiskers had been. "No more roller skating," he said sadly. Eleanor was leaning up on one elbow, thinking. The treasure was in the book he was writing. What book was that? "It was Walden," said Edward promptly. He lived in Walden Pond and kept a journal, and then he wrote it all over again later, and the book was called Walden. Not for nothing was Edward the nephew of Uncle Freddie. "I'll bet we'll find the jewels in the book with the pages pasted together and the inside hollowed out like a box." He ran to the bookcase. "Aha," he said, "here it is." He pulled out a book and it flopped open. How disappointing, the pages all riffled separately apart. There was nothing on them or in them but black print. Disgusted, Eddie threw the book on the floor. Eleanor got up and squatted down beside it. She picked it up and looked at the outside. It was Walden, all right, by Henry David Thoreau. She opened it, and the book fell open at the flyleaf, and here Eleanor found the jewels. Written there were these words in familiar script. "To Ned and Nora, here are Henry's jewels, his Walden, a treasure for the world beyond price. I hope when you are grown up you will read it and see that his words are what Henry hoped they were, pearls from Coromandel and diamonds from Brazil. From your affectionate friend, Krishna." Wasn't that just like a grown-up? The treasure was a book. The diamonds and pearls were just words anybody could have for the reading. Edward grabbed the book. He meant to throw it at the wall. Then something made him stop. He looked at it, and then he put it carefully back in the bookcase. He put on his bathrobe and went whistling down the ladder steps. "Someday, I'll have to read it," he said, as his head disappeared below the trapdoor. Eleanor watched the top of his red head go down. Then she remembered something and shuddered. Part of the dream had been a nightmare. They might have been killed, and the treasure had hardly been worth the danger. Would all the others be like that? An old music box, a broken doll, an old book? Surely some of the others would be exchangeable for money. See ya.